Fantastic. So, hi everyone. We'll just give a few more minutes to allow people to join in, and then we'll get started. But yeah, it's an exciting day to discuss sustainability, right? We have the COP results coming in. Ingo, we just talked a little bit about it. You mentioned you saw some of the headlines. What did you see so far?
Well, I think the most important thing is with respect to the climate, we are, at least from the German perspective, on the correct, on the path towards the end of fossil energies. We will see how this will work and how this kicks in with respect to the CSDDD, which is also discussed and negotiated today. And let's see what's happening there.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening these days. It's very exciting. Like all we do at Responsibly is, of course, sustainability. So we're excited to see things moving. I don't know where the COP results lands yet. I'm hearing positive and negative things about it. We now finally have people condemning fossil fuels, but not ambitious enough. So let's see what actually comes out of it. But with that, I see people joining in now. So let's get started with the day. Today we'll discuss the LkSG. We'll do some tie-ins here and there to CSDDD. My name is Thomas. I'm one of the founders of Responsibly. I brought Ingo here today, who sits in the top German legal house Noerr. And we have a quite exciting agenda here today. The reason we created the webinar in the first place was to really combine the expertise sets that sits with both Ingo and I. We are working day to day implementing supply chain due diligence solutions with clients. We have dedicated technology modules for the LkSG. So we have a lot of very practical, nitty-gritty, hands-on experience of actually doing this due diligence with the suppliers. We work quite closely together with Ingo and the team in actually developing these solutions. So that's why we know them so well. And then, of course, Ingo, he literally wrote the book on LkSG. So a lot of very detailed insights there. Ingo, do you want to give a quick introduction of yourself?
Yes. So as Thomas said, I'm a partner at Noerr and working in the field of compliance and corporate law. And so we worked with Professor Schall and my colleague Pura Sanjani. I co-authored the commentary on the one commentary on the LkSG, together with a lot of people from our firm and also from companies. You find some insights there how companies manage to implement the LkSG. So yeah, and I'm looking forward to exchange ideas with Thomas because I think this act is special because you need a lot of disciplines to implement it. You need technology, you need broad human rights expertise, you need corporate law expertise. So it's a very exciting journey to implement and to take care of this act and the acts which will come in the future.
Yeah, 100% Ingo. And one of the major things that's of course happening now is that 1st of January, you have a kind of a new wave coming in since the bar is going down. So now companies just above 1,000 employees needs to start being compliant. And of course, what that also means is that companies with fewer resources, maybe less bargaining power, their suppliers, needs to now go very deep on supply chain sustainability due diligence. And what that means more than anything is that you need to make sure that you automate a lot of the work, that you're able to work with the suppliers in the most efficient way, because you simply cannot just rely on being a very, very big company and having a ton of resources. So that's also why the technology angle becomes increasingly more and more important. The way that we'll do the webinar today is that on our side from Responsibly, we'll bring some very concrete and practical examples. We'll also bring some showcases of what the technology can do to really help accelerate your efforts here. And then we've brought the most common questions that we hear our customers asking about LkSG, and then I'll ask them to Ingo as we go. So we get kind of a Q&A format going that's a little bit more interactive than you guys just sitting and watching 30 slides on compliance regulation. Of course, we're very, very happy to get your questions as well. There's a questions feature in the bottom of the screen that you can use to ask questions. There's also a chat function. We have somebody on our end who's monitoring that, who will try to answer the questions as we go. And we can also bring that into the conversation with Ingo and I. So please just ask questions as we go, so we make this a bit more interactive as well. The agenda for today is that we really want to go through practically how do you implement the different processes to be compliant with the Act. So the first section is we'll discuss a lot about how do you actually get started with the German Supply Chain Act, which is all about risk analysis and prioritization of your suppliers. Then we'll go into the actual due diligence of the individual suppliers. And we've divided that into two sections because we believe that it's very important that you're able to do research before that you engage your suppliers, simply because supplier engagement is very, very hard and your suppliers are drowning in these type of requests. So we'll discuss a very pragmatic approach to actually getting more information from your suppliers and reducing that burden. We'll then go into supplier engagement and discussing, okay, how do you actually start collaborating with your suppliers? That's a very key part of the LkSG, but how do you do it in a very efficient way? And then we'll talk about what happens when you discover things, violations or risks that you need to implement corrective action programs around. How does that actually work? How can you tackle it technology-wise, but also what are some of the legal complexities around it? And then we'll just finish off with some commentary about how Ingo and I, we typically both work together, but also individually on LkSG topics with clients. So that's the agenda for today. But to start out with, Ingo, can you give us a quick primer? Probably everybody here knows what the German supply chain is in kind of overall strokes, but can you give us just a quick recap of what does this regulation actually mean?
Of course. As you have said before, the Act initially applied to enterprises in Germany with at least 3,000 employees. From 2024, this threshold is lowered, and you fall within the scope if you have at least 1,000 employees. I think it's important to point out the core elements of the Act. This is the due diligence obligation, which means that you have to establish risk management system to identify, prevent, or minimize the risk of human rights violations and damage to the environment. This is why we focus on risk management, risk detection. And then it's important to keep in mind where to apply these due diligence obligations. This is your own business area. You have to look at the actions of contractual partners and of other, in certain cases, even indirect suppliers. So your responsibility is much broader than before. It's not your own factory gate, but it's also the entire supply chain where you have to look at. What is the aim of the Act? So you have to protect basically 11 internationally recognized human rights conventions, and the legal interests derived from these conventions are in the center of the Human Rights Act. These are, for example, child labor, slavery, forced labor, disregard of occupational safety, health obligations, minimum wage requirements, freedom for trade unions and employee representations, and then with respect to the environment, waste management, access to water, etc. So this is a broad set of rights which you have to keep in mind, and which are in the focus of these due diligence obligations. And if you fail to comply, as always, there may be administrative fines. They can amount of up to 2% of your annual global turnover, but which is, I think, even at least also quite dangerous for companies, at least for some. You can exclude it from the award of public contracts. And of course, your reputation can be damaged, and this might be even more difficult with respect to attracting young people, HR issues, if you're deemed as a company not to follow the rules of this act, or to violate human rights. So this is in a nutshell what it's all about, and it's difficult to implement.
100%. Thank you so much for that, Ingo. And we're doing this webinar on an interesting day, right? Because this is supposedly the last negotiation for the EU legislation, the CSDDD, which in many ways has a lot of similarities to the LkSG. Can you comment on that, Ingo? What kind of, if you are a company, you've already implemented the LkSG, now the CSDDD comes in, are there any synergies between these two acts?
Yes, of course. I mean, you will find also the due diligence obligations as at the center of the CSDDD. And so I think you can say you have laid a good groundwork and good basis if you have implemented the LkSG. So even if it might be altered or even completely amended by the CSDDD, what you have done so far is not useless, because you see the same elements in the CSDDD. Maybe there are nuances that you have different bits and pieces, but the core is the same.
Yeah. No, that's great to hear, and we can see it from our perspective as well when we're developing solutions, that a lot of the same elements are present, which means that we can use the same type of thinking in actually delivering the solutions to it. Right now, it's looking a little bit broader, so it's tackling more topics than the LkSG, which is, I think, positive from an impact perspective. But let's see what the final deal actually lands on. Great. So the first part of the agenda point here today is really how to get started, which is all about risk. So one of the things that we really like about the LkSG Act, and honestly, this is the same with the upcoming EU legislation, is that focus on risk, because it makes it easier to prioritize, and actually makes it possible to prioritize amongst the ESG topics in your supply chain. But Ingo, what is a risk actually defined as according to the LkSG?
That is also already defined in Section 2 of the Act, and it says it's that a human rights risk, similar risk for the environmental protected right, for the environmental rights which are protected, a risk within the meaning of this Act is a condition in which, on the basis of factual circumstances, there's a sufficient probability that a violation of the prohibitions just mentioned, derived from these international conventions, is imminent. So, that is the definition of the Act. Mm-hmm. And you need to detect the factual circumstances, and to look, and then you have to judge whether there's a sufficient probability that a violation will take place.
Got it. And I guess one of the things that you'll quickly land on when you start doing this risk analysis is that there's a lot of risk across a very big supply chain. So you'll need to tackle it somehow. What does BAFA say about prioritization, Ingo?
Prioritization is, of course, an important aspect of the risk analysis, because if we go one step back, the Act and also BAFA as the competent authority wants to see companies dealing with the Act and wants to see them involved. And so this means that you have to look at your resources and to guide your resources where you can use them best. And this is, of course, at the most imminent risks and about the most difficult or most severe violation of the protected rights we just discussed. So yes, prioritization is possible, and it's even needed, because otherwise, if you just wanted to tackle all risks you have in the supply chain, you are not able to do that. This is the aim in the end, yeah, but you have to start getting started, and so it's important to prioritize.
Got it. Since the LkSG tackles many different topics, right? We discussed that quickly on the previous page, that there's a lot of different human rights and environmental topics, from child labor to waste management. Now, it feels a bit more urgent if you spot child labor in your supply chain to start tackling that versus not having the right waste management process in place. Is that a logic that holds, Ingo? Can you actually are you allowed to prioritize between topics as well?
That depends on the individual case. You have to tackle the risks you have detected according to Section 3 of the Act. And Section 3 has, mentions some elements which are important to look at. And so that means basically you have to look at your own involvement. So, for example, if you are not involved and if you cannot, so you have to look at the elements mentioned in Section 3. And with respect to the prioritization, in principle, it's not allowed to prioritize, but of course you would see in each case how you can end the violation which you deem more severe. And so if you look at the child topic and you have an influence on the on this risk, you should of course use your influence to stop this child law, child issue, the labor law issue. And if you have still resources left, then you of course tackle the environmental issue. But it's always you have to very carefully weigh all the elements of the factual elements, and then look according to Section 3 how you can tackle the risks.
Fantastic. And while that sounds complex, I actually really like this part of the regulation, because it also allows you to be pragmatic, right? You cannot be everywhere all at once. We need to really find out, how do we use the data, the risk information, severity information, your influence, which could be spent, and so on, to find out which topics do I tackle first. Where do I prioritize my action? So I think that's a very key point. Ingo, how do you actually get data on risk? Like, what tells you something is at risk?
I think it's important to look at the BAFA guidances. They are of course not binding, but they are very, very helpful with respect to implementing and getting started with the risk analysis. So, and if you look at this guidance, you see that there is a so-called abstract risk analysis. This means you look at the countries your suppliers are coming from, and you look at the different sectors your suppliers are working in. and then you have a well, so to speak, first step of your risk analysis, because you see where the most probability of risks is. So if you have, for example, a red country and a red sector, it's allowed, and then you should prioritize on these suppliers. And if you ask how do you get the data, then you can use publicly available studies. You can use, of course, software. And I think, which you should not forget as a company, you should definitely use the knowledge of the company, because when we discuss the topic with our clients, you see that most companies have a good understanding of their human rights risks along the supply chain. And a lot of companies have already worked on these issues. And so it's important to use this information, which is within the company, not for every single supplier, but for a lot of them. So data and then software, etc., is very important, but don't forget the human part, so to speak, and use the information which is in the company.
Fantastic, Ingo. Thank you so much for that. When we conduct risk analysis at Responsibly, we get into a lot of this complexity here, right? So there's a few different angles that, from our perspective, help you inform on risk. You have the industry lens, of course, where you can say, hey, in certain industries, in the example here that we have scrolling in the middle of the page, we have a building products manufacturer. Now, when you are shipping building products, then there are going to be some environmental topics, for example, that are more likely to be at risk with that type of service. Whereas if you're, for example, analyzing a service provider, then those topics are simply not at risk, right? So there's an industry angle here that's very important. There's a geographical angle that's very important. Again, in the example here in the middle, we're talking about a company based in China. And China simply comes with higher risks factors for some of the different social topics, like, for example, freedom of association and so on. And then there's the combination of these two angles as well, because sometimes you might be working with, let's say, a building products manufacturer in the UK, where you would say the UK may not be at very high risk in general for different social topics. But once you actually work in certain industries in the UK, like, for example, the buildings industry, then you start seeing these risks pop up. The same in China. For example, China, it's very easy to say overseas manufacturing, higher social risks. But fact is also that some industries in China and some specific locations in China are higher risks than others. And this is really where the complexity comes in, because we have this tendency, I think, to simplify and talk about human rights risks or sustainability risks. But the fact is, as we discussed earlier, the LkSG really covers different human rights topics within the supply chain, different environmental topics within the supply chain. And you want to make sure that you actually address risk data for each of these individually. So what Responsibly does is that we combine information from right now 34 different risk resources, from things like the US Department of State to larger risk indices like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Our perspective is that you can provide all data in one landscape. So as per Ingo's messages, you can actually also upload internal risk information if you want to have that weighed in your risk findings. And this product risk analysis, which generates a risk profile, as you can see here in the middle of the screen, we've actually made freely available. And the reason for that is that our ambition is to get more companies sourcing sustainably, right? And the first place to start is really risk, right? How do I prioritize? How do I find out which topics are material with my suppliers? So regardless of where you are in the profile, you can always go in and use Responsibly as just another perspective of what's the riskiness of my different suppliers. We don't charge for it. You can get started straight away. And I just want to pick out one of the questions here from the chat that Francisca asked, because she asked about how about all of these different parts of the regulation, like the UK Modern Slavery Act, for example. that overlaps with the forced labor criteria in the German Supply Chain Act. So the way that we tackle that at Responsibly is that we boil this down to the specific topics, right? So we'll never talk about human rights risk. We'll talk about the risk for example, modern slavery and forced labor. And that means that we will identify that risk regardless, and then we'll say that risk is actually relevant to both the UK Modern Slavery Act and the German Supply Chain Act, and in the future, quite soon, probably the CSDDD as well. So from our perspective, it's really a question of how do we accurately define the scope of these different pieces of regulation, and then make sure that we apply the relevant risk analysis for that scope wherever it's applicable. Now, there's a lot of nuance and complexity here, right? But spend comes into the picture in terms of helping you understand how much bargaining power do I have. As Ingo will tell you, it's not always an accurate representation to say I can just ignore low spend, right? Sometimes you have a lot of impact with your low spend suppliers, but it's definitely helpful in the overall picture to help you prioritize, and so on. So there's a lot of different nuances here, but to get started, it's really about understanding the locations, industries, and products you're sourcing, and what kind of the material topics and risks are within that supply chain. With that, let's continue to the next topic, which is basically saying, okay, so now we understand what's at risk, what I should focus on in my supply chain. Now, how do I actually start understanding how my suppliers are doing on these different topics, where I need to take action, whether some of that risk is mitigated, and so on. One of our key points in Responsibly is that you need to postpone engaging your suppliers, and you need to do a little bit of work up front. Now, we help you automate that, so don't worry. It's not like we're adding extra labor, but there's a lot of information out there already that helps inform you about the performance of your suppliers. And what that does is that it further helps you prioritize action, but it also reduces the amount of information you actually ask the suppliers about. What you can essentially do without even contacting the supplier is that you can understand whether a supplier has already gone through social audit processes, whether they're already certified in some of these topics that the Act is actually addressing. We can also typically find out whether the supplier has signed relevant policies, right? Maybe they've already signed certain code of conducts and so on. And we can also start scanning sanctions databases and media landscapes to see if they've been mentioned in, for example, child labor conflicts before. So there's a lot of information out there already. You see on the example here on the page, the video that we're scrolling through, we're basically just going to a topic here that has been identified as risk, which is forced labor. And then we're also seeing that, hey, this supplier has actually gone through a SEDEX audit, which addresses forced labor, where they perform quite well. And if we hold those two pieces of data together, we now have a risk, but we also have a mitigation for that risk, which is a recognized third-party accredited third audit, right? So there's a lot of data out there already, which helps you basically inform your assessment of the supplier. Ingo, this type of automated research here, right? If you find out that the supplier has gone through a verified social audit, for example, is that sufficient from a due diligence point of view, or how should we think about conducting research on suppliers before actually starting to engage them?
I think it's very important what you said, and it perfectly fits with BAFA's approach because BAFA has just published a guidance on the collaboration in the Supply Chain Act. And I think this was due to the fact that some companies probably misused the idea of sending out questionnaires, or maybe there was a wrong impression that the companies which send out questionnaires to each and every supplier, that they might try to let the suppliers do their due diligence work. I'm not sure whether this was the case, but at least the impression was there, and thus BAFA handed out a guidance and said, look, This is not the idea of the act. If you fall within the scope of the act, you have to do your due diligence work, and therefore it's important to find out which supplier you should on which supplier you should perform a deeper due diligence, or where you need a deep dive, and where you probably can maybe to find out where the automated research might be sufficient. So you cannot say in each and every case it's fine if you have the automated results, but it's of course an important help to prioritize your suppliers and to decide on which supplier you send a certain and on which suppliers you send questionnaires to find out more on their supply chain and their potential risk profile.
100%. And again, I think that's where the act comes in and gets quite pragmatic, which I like, because unfortunately the consequence that we've seen of supply chain sustainability becoming a more and more prominent topic, which is very, very good, is that your suppliers are just drowning in questionnaires and data requests, right? So they're going through the same hoops again and again. We've talked with some suppliers that have bbeen audited on the same measure 60 times per year, right? Because nobody talks to each other and nobody's able to, understand each other's kind of procedures and certifications and audits and so on. And that's just a massive shame, right? So our perspective here is really, we got to be better at leveraging the work that's already being done with suppliers, and then really use that as a baseline. One of the problems you then have when you get really, really good at this is that you find out that, now I found a violation with another product that my supplier is producing, or maybe a site. Maybe I'm buying soybeans from them, but they have this cocoa farm in Africa where there has been violations and problems before. And that then comes with a question of saying, what do I then do, Ingo, if I find a violation or a risk that's attached to a supplier that I'm using, but not directly the products or the sites that I'm purchasing from? Do you need to do anything about that? Do you have a responsibility for that?
You have, you don't have a responsibility for a different supply chain, but of course, in this case, you have to be aware that there might be unlawful practices, not only in the supply chain you have detected, but also in your own supply chain. But so it's definitely there. If you have these hints and information, then you should definitely have a close look at what the supplier does in the supply chain, which is relevant for your products.
Fantastic. And it ultimately, I guess, really ties back to risk, right? If you know that a supplier is violating, one human rights policy in one area of the world, they may not do in whatever's relevant for your supply chain, but it might mean that you actually want to take a deeper look at what they're doing at your sites.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Sometimes you need to engage the supplier, right? So we cannot get around that. And I think that's also where the impact of these supply chain legislation really comes in. We are now, funnily enough, working with Chinese companies on the German Supply Chain Act because they have German customers, right, that are asking them the same type of requirements. So you have this amazing ripple effects through the supply chain. That's really the potential of the act. But it requires supply engagement. And we just talked about supply engagement being hard. Ingo, when do you need to engage a supplier?
Well, as there are different situations. First is if you had performed your first analysis, which we should show, and if you then detected that there is a risk that you have a high-risk supplier, you need to understand more about his business and his business behavior and the risks which might result from his activities. And this is one thing. And on the other hand, it's obviously the case if you have detected a risk or even a violation of the rights, then you need to engage the supplier to stop the violation and to work with him to find a solution to this situation.
Fantastic. That makes sense. And with supply chains, we have this big complexity that they're multi-tiered, right? So it might be fairly easy for you to engage your first-tier suppliers. You know them, you have a contact person there, but the supply chain stretches all the way back to kind of the raw materials and so on. The LkSG, of course, talks about sub-tier suppliers. So Ingo, what's the position of sub-tier supplier analysis? What's your responsibility? Do you need to engage them and so on? How does that work?
So sub-tier suppliers are only affected or fall within the scope of the Act with respect to Section 9. Because then and it's important that you need indications that there is a violation of human rights related or environmental related obligations at indirect suppliers. So this is so-called you need a substantiated knowledge of these violations, and then you need to carry out a risk analysis, lay down preventive measures, and draw up and implement a prevention concept, and update your own policy statement. But as you said, it's you don't have direct contracts with this supplier, and therefore it's difficult to handle this situation. In some contracts or in some supply chains, the audit rights and rights under the LkSG are agreed along the supply chain, but this is not in your hand. I mean, if your direct supplier managed to agree on these clauses with its sub-tier suppliers, it's fine. Then you can rely on some sort of contractual agreements, but still it's difficult to influence the sub-tier suppliers. And this is basically then comes down to your economic influence. If you're an important customer, your sub-tier supplier will be willing to discuss the issue. But if you're not important, it's difficult. You don't have rights if they are not, as I said, agreed in the contracts.
Got it. So I guess part of the solution here is also to make sure that your suppliers are working through supply chain due diligence, just like you are, which is probably why we end up working with Chinese clients, right? Even though they're not directly impacted by the law.
Correct.
Fantastic. One of the things you see quite often when you start engaging suppliers is that they provide these self-assessment, right? They say, hey, no, there's no child labor, it's all fine. Or maybe they say, hey, I actually have gone through this audit, but they don't upload the documentation behind it, and so on. So there's a big kind of data verification question here. How should a buyer or kind of a buying company think about this? Like, what quality of data do you need? How deep do you need to verify this data?
I think it's important to do a plausibility check, because I mean, if you have a company working in a high-risk country, and then and with respect to certain rights protected by the Due Diligence Act, and the company gives a green light on all these issues which usually occur in these countries, then it's of course might be worth to have a look at it. So important is do a plausibility check. You don't have to go into every single detail, but it must be plausible to rely on that.
Got it. That makes a ton of sense. When we help our clients on supplier engagement, it's really important to think about how do we reduce the burden on both the supplier and you as a buyer, right? So how can we take care of as much of the work through automation, but also how can we make it very, very easy for the supplier to actually help you comply with this specific law? There's an example here on the right-hand side, which is showing one feature of our product, which I think is quite exciting, which is conditionality. So basically, you can actually go in your data request and set up conditionality. So you say, for example, here, living wages. I only want to engage a supplier on living wages when they're at risk for living wages. And you can also add that together with the data collection we've done through the automated research and even say, I only want to engage them when they're at risk for living wages. And also, if they've actually already been audited on living wages and the result there was good, then I don't need to engage them further on living wages. And I think that ability to dynamically touch base with suppliers on where the risk is most significant is extremely important, because otherwise you end up just bombarding suppliers with these very, very extensive questionnaires. And if any of you listening are sitting in the sustainability team and you have your own B2B clients, you've probably received some of these questionnaires where you've just been frustrated that, hey, why are they asking me about child labor? Now I'm just talking personally, I'm a software company in Denmark, right? This is not a risk topic, right? Let's ask me about the important stuff, right? So that's important. Of course, you can use engagements to cover, which we'll discuss in a little bit, preventative measures, making sure that they actually have the right code of conducts and so on in place. The entire tool is fully customizable. That's very important because, as we discussed with Francisca earlier, you might also have other due diligence requirements, right? Maybe you also need to be compliant with the UK Modern Slavery Act. Maybe you fall into the scope of the CSDDD. Maybe you have a decarbonization objective and you want to make sure that all of that gets included in the same data request. So it's very customizable, but it's also, there's presets, right? So if you just want to kind of use our perspective on how you basically engage the suppliers on the different LkSG topics, we have you working out of the box, and then you can kind of go down and customize a little bit later. The two last points that I want to mention that are extremely important is that, one, it is really important to automate this engagement. Depending on your size, you're going to have thousands of different suppliers that you need to start working with. That's just extremely time consuming. So one thing is sending out the data request. The other thing is being able to collect the information and analyze the information automatically. And also small things like just sending out reminders automatically and so on. We take care of all of that for you. And what you just end up with is that you go through this measure using fewer resources and you just get more data coming in as well.
And as I wanted to add, this is exactly compatible with the BAFA approach, which said, look, you have to do your own analysis and you have to do your own supply chain, your own due diligence, and just ask the suppliers with a risk-based approach and think about before asking suppliers, sending out questionnaires.
Yeah. And the last part, of course, is that your suppliers are probably based all over the world. So another very easy way to just get better engagement of your suppliers is to engage them in their local languages, right? So, instead of sending out English or German data requests to your Chinese suppliers, we can now engage them in Chinese as well, and we can do that dynamically. So there's a lot of these small things that are just very, very difficult to do in a spreadsheet and on emails that can be done once you start using technology platforms in a much more efficient way. I'm just getting a question in here from Francesco. Let's just take that straight away. So Ingo, Francesco is asking about risk profiling, and in particular, if you find a regional problem, how much should that be weighed, or should it be weighed at all versus kind of very, I guess, specific locations and so on, or just suppliers that have a high variability in where the operations are placed. Like if there is a problem in Asia, how does that count versus a certain region in China and so on?
I think I didn't quite get it. So the question, because this didn't work right now here. Do you see? Here. Could you elaborate some more about risk profiling? Okay. Should be weighted at all. I mean, the regional problems, they are one of the parts of the risk analysis. So you have to start with a so-called first step of the risk analysis, and you have to look at, as we said, sector and region of your supplier, the country risks, so to speak. And now, if those have high variability in the supplier's area of operation, it depends. So you have to find out basically where your factory is from where you source. For example, of course, if you have a factory in the Uyghur country, then in Xinjiang, it's probably, of course, an even higher risk than if you have a factory in Shanghai, so to speak. And thus, it's important also to look not just at the country, but also at the region where you source. I hope this goes in the right direction, or please ask if this is, well...
Yeah, and I think maybe just to add from our side here is that, again, very pragmatically, you'll find some risk resources being quite broad and commenting on, for example, the broad risks in some areas of the world, and then some risks being highly specific to a very, very specific location. And of course, the more specific the risk is, in many cases, the more the more significant that risk is, right? If your supplier operates in a certain region in China where there's a very, very significant risk for child labor, and you also know that this is in the apparel industry, for example, where we've also seen a lot of child labor violations, then that severity just becomes higher than if you're basing the entire analysis on saying, my suppliers overseas, and I know in general overseas there's kind of a larger human rights risks in general, right? So it helps you a little bit with saying how specific is that piece of data, because it's gonna help inform you on how significant is the risk actually for that specific supplier. I'm just being a little bit mindful of time here, so let's move on to the last part, which is basically saying, okay, now we've done our risk analysis, we've done our research, we've engaged the suppliers, we've identified certain violations and risks. Now, what do we do about it? How do we take a corrective action on these different topics here? And I'll just start with you, Ingo. When violations are identified, what is my responsibility as a buyer?
Depends in your own business area. You have to stop them, and with respect to your supplier, you have to work on a corrective action plan to stop this at your tier, and so yes, in your own area, you're obliged to stop the violation, and with respect to the supply chain, you have to work on ways to stop the violation, but you don't have to immediately stop them, but you have to find solutions on this.
Fantastic, and you alluded a little bit to it in that answer there, but how involved do you need to be as a buyer in setting up these improvement programs? Can you just tell the supplier, hey, there's a problem, fix it, and then you're done, or
no, you have to work with him to find a solution. So that's your obligation to find a solution with him.
Yeah.
You can't do it on your own, but it's not just the case that you say, well, please fix it. I don't care, just do it.
Got it. And once they've been started on this program, how closely do you need to monitor improvement? Is it enough that you just kind of check in with them next year and see how that's going, or how should you think about monitoring these improvement programs?
Yeah, you have to very closely monitor the program and check whether the steps and milestones you have agreed on are reached. Yeah, so it's a very active process because it remains your own responsibility.
Got it. And then maybe as the last part, before we kind of jump into how you can do this in a solution, what are the types of measures that you can take with your suppliers?
For example, you can think about different procurement strategies. This is one of the probably most imminent thing. If there are problems with respect to working hours, then you can discuss on how you on your side can improve things so that you don't have to violate working hours. That is, for example, one way. So you have to think about what you can do. You have to think about the angle and the possibilities of the supplier, and then you have to find a solution.
Fantastic. That makes a ton of sense. If we then jump on to how we think about it from a solution perspective. So when we break it down, there are really kind of 3 overall things you can do with your supply chain. Very easily, if this is a non-strategic supplier, you can simply just move spend, right? Reduce spend, reduce your impact, stop working with the supplier, and so on. Oftentimes, that's not the case. And honestly, it's not really, I guess, the point of the act either, right? The point is really to kind of collaborate with the suppliers to improve. And here we make a distinction between what we call preventative measures and remedial measures, and the Act does as well. Preventative measures are things like, you've identified a risk. Okay, let's make sure that the supplier has the right processes in place. Let's make sure they sign our code of conduct. Maybe let's roll them into trainings. And so on. Maybe this risk is so severe that we actually want to conduct audits, and we've prioritized them for our audit program so we can get deeper with them, right? So there are different preventative measures, and then there are remedial measures, which gets very, very specific, right? So this is, as Ingo said, now we have a violation here. We know that the working hours are simply not, where they need to be. We need to remediate that. And that's where we get super specific, right? So typically, from our perspective, we work together with audit providers and so on to make sure that the remedial measures are tracked and reflected in the platform, and you can collaborate with the supplier on it, because it does get very nitty-gritty, right? From saying, hey, there's not the right safety caps on these specific sewing machines, to coming back and rechecking and make sure that they've implemented the right kind of safety equipment. On the right-hand side, what we're just doing there is that, again, one of the things we really want to make sure is that we're able to collaborate with all of these different certifying and auditing bodies out there. So we have a very broad kind of list of partnerships where we can help work together with the auditors of SEDEX or Amphorian and so on to make sure that the right processes are actually in place. And I'm just being super, super mindful of time here, because we are coming towards the end of the hour. So we'll just round off here to discuss a little bit how Ingo and I, we typically work with clients on the LkSG Act and supply chain sustainability. And then, as we go through that, if you guys have any other questions that we haven't covered today, make sure you write them in the chat and the questions, and then we'll address them here towards the end. So as we kind of alluded in the beginning, what I think is really exciting is that there are many different facets of the German Supply Chain Act. At Responsibly, we tackle it from the technology angle. We mentioned in the beginning that we do have a concept of a free risk analysis to help you get started. So if you are on that stage where you want to find out what do I actually need to tackle where in my supply chain, you can get started today, create a profile, upload your suppliers, and get access to the risk resources we have access to. So you can really get started, and that's not going to cost you a dime. But where it really becomes impactful for companies is that that's just a lot of work. So you can get it automated through us. We help you automate the due diligence. We help you automate the reporting cycle. We help you automate all of the analysis. And we have worked together with Noerr in this case to make sure that the solution is really defined according to the LkSG. Sometimes you need guidance because this is very, very complex, right? So now, sorry, Ingo, tell me a little bit about how do you guys typically guide companies on the LkSG?
So yeah, there's a broad range of advice we can give on the LkSG. We can advise and help with respect to the due diligence requirements, the risk analysis. We can implement this together with Thomas and his team, but we can of course also advise on certain topics, and which will become even more important I think in the next month and years. We can of course help you to deal with claims that you have violated the law, that these claims might come from the authorities, they might come from NGOs, the public, and so it's important to be prepared, and we can help there because we have a wide range of experience with compliance-related issues. So yeah, we are there for you then.
Fantastic. And of course, we both work with you guys individually. We also sometimes do a package together. So, reach out to Ingo or I, and we can have a little bit of discussion about where you are today and how we can help. With that, we're coming to the end of the webinar. I don't see any additional questions coming in. So what I just want to say is thank you so much for joining today. We'll make sure that we share the recordings of the webinar today with you on email after the event, so you can very easily have access to everything. Feel free to again reach out if you have any other questions coming up, feedback and so on. And then, yeah, let's be in touch and let's make the supply chain a little bit more sustainable. Have a fantastic day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Bye.